The Ossuary Bloom, Chapter 7. All that is solid. The only light in the cramped habitation unit bled from a single overworked data slate. It painted Aris Thorne in shades of flickering blue and gray, carving his face out of the oppressive darkness. His apartment, a standard Veridia Spire coffin, felt smaller than usual tonight, the neo-Gothic arches of its ceiling pressing down like the ribs of some great dead beast. The air was thick with the station's signature perfume, the cloying sweetness of nutrient paste clinging to the metallic tang of recycled water, all cut through with the sharp, clean scent of ozone from his laboring console. A constant low hum vibrated through the floor, Æthelgard's failing heartbeat. He leaned closer to the screen, the faint light glinting off the silver threads in his unkempt hair. On the slate, a waveform shivered and spasmed. It was a mess, a chaotic scribble of corrupted data captured during the last resonance event in the ossuary. Garbage. That's what the architect's suppression team had called it. A system glitch, a feedback loop in the cryopod's neural monitoring. But Aris had been there. He had seen the way the corpse's fingers had twitched, the way the rime of ice on its observation window had momentarily cleared in a perfect, hand-sized circle. He had felt it, a pressure in his skull, a whisper just beneath the threshold of hearing, and he had recorded it. This fragment of noise, this digital ghost, was all he had managed to siphon before Vesperlirian and her sterile-suited goons had descended, their field emitters washing the area in a wave of null energy that felt like sandpaper on the soul. "Come on," he muttered, his voice a dry rasp. "Show me." His fingers moved across the slate's interface, a frantic but precise dance. He was running a cascade of proprietary filters, algorithms he'd designed years ago for mapping the fossilized neural pathways of extinct alien fauna. They were never meant for this, for sifting through the digital detritus of a human soul. The console whined in protest, its fans kicking into a higher gear. A bead of sweat traced a path down his temple.
He isolated a segment, a spike of anomalous coherence just 1.7 seconds long, and looped it. The audio hissed from the slate's tiny speaker. A wash of static, like a dead channel between worlds. Then underneath it, something else, a pattern. Faint, distorted, but undeniably there. It wasn't a voice, not yet. It was the precursor to a voice, the shape of a thought given electrical form. He ran another filter, this one designed to strip out ambient system noise. The slate's processor load spiked into the red. The static sharpened, thinned. For a fraction of a second, the sound resolved into a single, elongated vowel, a sigh, a breath. The sound of a name being held on the tongue but never spoken. His own breath hitched. He felt that familiar, dangerous thrill, the same one that had driven him across uncharted worlds, the same one that had led him to that fateful expedition on Xylos. The thrill of discovery, forever tangled with the acid of guilt. "Isolate and amplify," he whispered, his command barely audible over the hum of the station. Cross-reference vocal signature against personal archive. Designation, Lyra. The slate chirped a confirmation. The word hung in the stale air of his room, an artifact from another life. Lyra. A name he rarely dared to speak, yet one that echoed in every silent moment. The system began its search, cross-referencing the pathetic scrap of a signal against the few recordings he had left of her. Voicemails, a snippet from a holiday message, her laughter captured on a shaky personal log. He waited, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The progress bar crept across the bottom of the screen with agonizing slowness. This was madness. Hoke was a toxin on Athelgard, and he was mainlining it. He was trying to find his dead wife in a burst of random energy from a stranger's corpse. He was an echo-lost scientist chasing his own delusions. He pushed himself back from the console, the legs of his chair scraping against the grimy deck plating. The hope was curdling into frustration, the familiar precursor to despair. It was nothing, a glitch, a trick of light and sound, his own grief-addled mind projecting patterns onto chaos. He was about to shut it all down, to consign the data to the void and himself to another sleepless, dream-haunted night cycle. Then the slate chimed, not an error tone, but a soft affirmative bell. Match found. 4.8% probability.
His blood went cold. 4.8%. Statistically insignificant, a rounding error, and yet it wasn't zero. He leaned forward again, his face inches from the screen. He bypassed the audio and rerouted the signal through a visual reconstruction algorithm, a desperate, last-ditch effort. A piece of forbidden tech he'd bought on the black market, designed to translate raw neural data into rudimentary imagery. It was unstable, prone to artifacts and outright lies. "Run it," he commanded. The screen dissolved into a blizzard of pixelated noise. The hiss from the speakers intensified, a digital scream. The slate shuddered. The lights in his hub unit flickered once, twice, then stabilized. The noise on the screen began to coalesce. It was like watching a photograph develop in a poison bath. Shapes swam in the digital chaos, jagged lines, impossible geometries, the ghosts of 1,000 corrupted files. And then, for less than a single heartbeat, the static parted like a curtain. A face. Her face. It was Lyra, not as she was in the end, but as he remembered her best. Her dark hair pulled back, the small inquisitive tilt of her head, the quiet intelligence in her eyes. It was a mosaic of data rot and light, her features composed of shivering pixels, the colors all wrong, faded golds, static blues, deep, inky grays. There was no warmth, no life. It was a death mask made of information. Her lips were parted as if on the verge of speaking, but her expression was unnervingly blank, a perfect, hollow vessel. He stopped breathing. Time itself seemed to stop, the station's hum fading into nothingness. The universe had collapsed to this single, impossible image on his screen. It was her. A flicker of her. A 4.8% probability ghost in the machine. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The image tore itself apart. Her eyes dissolved into a cascade of green and black code. Her mouth stretched into a silent, pixelated scream before shattering into a million points of light. The screen flashed a blinding white, then settled back into the angry, meaningless hiss of static. A new message blinked in the corner. Data fragment enacted, irrecoverable. No. The word was a choked whisper. He stabbed at the controls, his movements suddenly clumsy, desperate. Rerun the sequence, reload from cache, undo. But there was nothing to undo. The fragment was spent. The fleeting pattern had collapsed back into chaos, burned out by the very act of observation. He was left staring at his own reflection in the dark screen, a pale, haunted man, his eyes wide with a terrible, newfound certainty. The frustration was gone. The cautious scientific hope was gone. In their place, a cold, sharp obsession began to crystallize in his gut. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't his grief playing tricks on him. She was in there. Somehow, some part of her was trapped in the station's digital purgatory. He pushed away from the console and stood, his gaze fixed on the swirling static as if he could will her image to reappear. The air in the room felt different now, charged and watchful. The familiar hum of life support no longer sounded like decay. It sounded like a promise of a signal waiting to be found. Lyra! He knew with a certainty that terrified and electrified him that he would tear Ethelgard apart to hear it again. The air in Hroldar's workshop was a thick cocktail of competing decays. From the rust gardens beyond his pressure-sealed door seeped the cloying, damp earth sweetness of hydroponic rot. From his own domain came the sharp, metallic tang of overloaded processors and the ozone-laced hum of stolen power conduits bleeding energy into the humid atmosphere. Wires, thick as jungle vines and brittle with age, snaked across every surface, feeding a monstrous, jury-rigged decryption rig that whined like a dying animal. It was the only source of light, its single monitor painting Hroldar's face in a shifting wash of blues and grays. He leaned forward, the stool groaning under his weight. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the console. On the screen, a waterfall of encrypted data cascaded downwards, an impenetrable language of symbols and fractured code. For 6 hours, his brute force algorithm had been throwing itself against the chip's security, a digital battering ram against an adamantium gate. A fool's errand, probably. Most architect tech was ossified, layered with security protocols that were generations ahead of the scavenged trash he worked with. But this chip, this was different.
He'd seen the architect suppression team drop it. A flicker of silver falling from a gloved hand in the chaos of their sanitization sweep. They were there to quell a low-level resonance event in the Ossuary's periphery, and they moved with a brutal, practiced efficiency. But one of them had been careless, and Hroldar, a creature born of carelessness and decay, had been there to profit from it. He had expected payroll data, shift rosters, something mundanely bureaucratic that he could maybe leverage for a few hundred echoes on the black market. But the encryption was too strong for that, far too strong. This was military grade, layered in quantum-entangled keys that his poor machine could only guess at, one agonizing permutation at a time. Another cycle failed. A crimson banner flashed across the top of the screen. Attempt 9,471,036 failed. Hroldar ran a grimy hand over his face, the stubble on his jaw rasping against his palm. The power drain was immense. He was siphoning energy directly from a primary hydroponics conduit, a crime that would earn him a one-way trip to a nutrient vat if a technocrat patrol stumbled upon it. Was it worth it? Was this sliver of plastic and gold worth the risk of becoming plant food? Survival is the only law, he thought, the words a familiar, bitter mantra. And survival requires an edge. Trust was weakness. Hope was a delusion. But information was a currency more stable than echoes, more potent than a plasma cutter. And the architects, for all their talk of the great stillness, were guarding something on this chip with the ferocity of a starving dog. His eyes drifted to a corner of the workshop where a patch of pale bioluminescent fungi pulsed with a soft ethereal light. It grew over a small tarnished silver frame, the glass long since cracked. He didn't let himself look at the faded image within. He never did. But the memory was always there, a low-level radiation poisoning his thoughts. The memory of a small hand in his, of a cough that never went away, of the slow, inevitable fade-out caused by the very air, the very water of this cursed dying station. The architects and their stillness hadn't saved her. Their order was just a prettier, more organized version of the decay that permeated everything.
That was why he kept the algorithm running. Not for hope. Hope was for the echo lost. He did it for the price. Everything had a price, the architect's secrets most of all. A sudden, high-pitched chime cut through the whining of the fans. Hroldar jolted, his gaze snapping back to the screen. The cascade of gibberish had stopped. The crimson banner was gone. In its place, a single line of stark white text blinked patiently. Sector 7, decryption successful. One file accessed. His breath hitched. Just one? Out of what must be thousands of encrypted packets? File _ corrupted. Attempting partial reconstruction. The screen flickered, and an image began to render, glitching and tearing at the edges. It wasn't text. It was a schematic, a blueprint of dizzying complexity. Lines of blue and gold crisscrossed a gray background, denoting power conduits, data links, and structural supports. Hroldar leaned closer, his nose almost touching the glass. His mind, honed by years of salvaging and reverse engineering, began to trace the pathways. He recognized the layout. The cavernous chambers, the transport tubes, the rows upon rows of cryogenic pods. It was the ossuary levels, a section of them at least. But the annotations were all wrong. They weren't the public-facing designations he knew from Scavener's station maps. These were technical, internal. Biomass Holding Bay, Gamma. Neural Interface Matrix, 7C. His fingers flew across the control panel, zooming in, panning across the corrupted diagram. He was looking for something, though he didn't know what. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady, low hum of the station. Why protect a simple blueprint with this level of security? And then he saw it. A central node, a hub from which countless smaller data lines radiated like a spider's web. It was connected to the neural interface systems of 1,000 pods. A system he knew, a phenomenon whispered about in the darkest corners of the station. A word that made the architects dispatch heavily armed suppression squads. The official story was that resonance was a system glitch, a feedback loop in the failing neural storage networks, a ghost in the machine, harmless but unnerving, an acceptable anomaly in a decaying world. But the label on the schematic, rendered in a cold, precise sans-serif font that was perfectly uncorrupted, told a different story. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a loop. The label next to the terrifyingly complex node read System _ designation Resonance, and beneath it a secondary tag, a status update. Status Containment Failure. Containment. The word hit Hroldar like a physical blow. You don't contain a glitch, you fix it. You don't build a system to contain feedback, you insulate against it. You contain a plague, a prisoner, a weapon. You contain something you are terrified will get out. The cynical curiosity that had fueled him for hours evaporated, replaced by the cold, sharp clarity of absolute terror. This wasn't just a secret. This was a foundational lie. The architects weren't managing a malfunction. They were fighting a war against something they had, at some point, held captive. Resonance wasn't an accident. It was an escapee. Hroldar shoved himself back from the console, the stool scraping loudly on the metal floor. His workshop,
His cluttered sanctuary of scavenged parts and broken dreams suddenly felt like a tomb. The whining rig, the dripping condensation, the very air itself seemed to press in on him, heavy with the weight of what he now knew. His gaze fell on the tiny chip still slotted into the rig's port. It was no longer just a potential payday. The avarice was still there, a hot coal in his gut, but it was a different kind now. It was no longer about a few thousand echoes to make life a little easier. This was the kind of truth that could burn the entire station to the ground. The kind of truth that the architects would kill for, without hesitation, without a trace. He looked at the glowing screen, at the two words that had fractured his reality. Containment failure. He had it, a tangible piece of the lie. And in the decaying, paranoid world of Ethelgard, that made him either the most powerful man on the station or the next one to be silently erased. The grav lift ascended with a hum so pure it felt like a violation. Vespera's ears, still attuned to the cacophony of the ossuary levels, the drip of viscous condensation, the grinding complaint of ancient machinery, the wet, final silence after the suppression, struggled to adjust. Here, in the main spire of the architects of silence, the air did not smell of formaldehyde and ozone. It was scoured clean, carrying only the faintest, most sterile hint of synthesized lilac, a fragrance with no memory of soil or rain. The walls were not weeping rust and bioluminescent fungi. They were panels of polished obsidian, reflecting a distorted, elongated version of herself, her gray technocrat's uniform stark against the void black. Stillness upon you. The greeting was a law, not a pleasantry. She stood before the commander's door, a seamless slate of brushed steel that absorbed all light. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a chaotic, biological drumbeat that felt obscene in this sanctuary of order. She forced it down, regulating her breathing, chasing the great stillness her training demanded. The suppression had been efficient. That was the word, the correct word. The resonance event in Ossuary sector GAMMA9 had been a chaotic spike of unprecedented amplitude, a shriek of scrambled memory that had caused 3 nearby cryopods to shudder and leak, their diagnostic lights flashing in a frantic, meaningless rhythm. The suppression team had moved in, and she had observed, as was her duty. She had watched them deploy the null field emitters. She had watched the biosigns of the awakened, the barely there flickers of neural activity, and the panicked biosigns of the 2 dreg maintenance workers who had been caught in the vicinity, all flatten into perfect, unwavering lines. Total. The erasure had been total. Her terminal chimed softly, a single, placid tone. The steel door slid open without a sound. Commander Cassian's office was a cube of muted gold and gray. One wall was a window, a vast pane of plexiglass showing the marbled, swirling skin of the gas giant Kepler 186f below, a constant, silent storm. The other walls were bare, save for the single shimmering pane of a holographic data slate that hovered beside Cassian's chair. He sat perfectly still, his back to the cosmos, a man carved from the same cold certainty as the station's Gothic arches. His face was a mask of placid neutrality,
his hands steepled before him. He did not look at her. "Report," he said. The word was not a request. It was an anchor point in the silence. Vespera walked to the center of the room, her boots making no sound on the sound-dampening floor. She clasped her hands behind her back, a parade rest posture that felt both formal and defensive. "Commander, at 7:43 station time, a Level 3 resonance event was logged in Ossuary Sector Gamma Line, Sublevel C. Amplitude exceeded predicted parameters by a factor of 4. The source was localized to cryopod 77 Kilo Delta." "Contents of 77 Kilo Delta?" Cassian's voice was unchanging, a monotone designed to convey pure information. "Corbin Vance, deceased 87 years prior, former hydroponics foreman, no history of resonance sensitivity in his lineage." She recited the data flawlessly. It was a catechism of the dead. "The event caused sympathetic instability in 3 adjacent pods. 2 Dreg-class maintenance workers were present within the immediate contagion radius." "And the suppression protocol?" Here it was. The knot in her stomach tightened. Protocol 9 Omega was enacted. The null field emitters were deployed. All unsanctioned neural activity in the sector was, neutralized. The word felt like ash in her mouth. Neutralized, like a chemical spill. Not like 2 men whose panicked shouts she could still hear echoing in her memory, frantic and high-pitched, before they were cut off into absolute nothing. Cassian made a minute gesture, and the holographic slate beside him flickered, displaying the flat lines of the suppression report, a graph of perfect, beautiful peace. The protocol was successful then. The stillness was restored.
Vespera's training screamed at her to agree, to nod and accept the closure of the file. But the image of the dregs' faces, wide-eyed, terrified, was burned behind her own. The architect's ideology promised tranquility, a release from the painful chaos of emotion and memory. What she had witnessed felt less like tranquility and more like amputation. "Commander," she began, her own voice startling her with its slight tremor. She cleared her throat. "The collateral biosignal erasure, it was total. The protocol did not differentiate between the resonance echo and the active neural patterns of the workers. Was such an extreme measure necessary for a Level 3 event?" The silence that followed was heavy, immense. Vespera could feel the gaze of the gas giant at her back, a silent, swirling witness. Cassian finally turned his head, his pale eyes pinning her in place. They were eyes that had seen too many reports, too many flat lines, and had long ago decided they were preferable to the messy alternative. "Technician," he said, his voice dropping half a register, becoming something colder and sharper. "You are questioning the foundational precepts of our order. A flicker of resonance is not a malfunction. It is a disease, a corruption of the great stillness. You do not treat a spreading cancer with palliative care. You excise it. Absolutely." He gestured to the window. "Out there is chaos. In here we have order. An order bought and paid for with vigilance." He leaned forward, the first sign of motion she had seen from him. "Perfect stillness requires a firm hand. The lives of 2 dregs
are a regrettable but mathematically acceptable cost to prevent a cascade that could threaten the entire station. Their stillness is now assured, permanently." Her burgeoning doubt withered under the frost of his logic. It was unassailable. It was the truth she had been taught to believe her entire life. And yet, it felt wrong, a deep, instinctive wrongness that logic could not erase. "I understand, Commander," she said, her voice now a perfect, hollow echo of his own calm. "Stillness upon you."
Indeed. Cassian turned back to the data slate. He waved a hand, and the suppression report vanished, replaced by a personnel file. A man's face, gaunt and haunted, stared out from the hologram. Vespera recognized him instantly. Dr. Aris Thorne, a name whispered with a mixture of pity and contempt in the technocrat circles. The disgraced xenobiologist, the man who chased ghosts. "One final matter," Cassian said, his tone back to its default neutrality. "Station logs place this individual, Dr. Aris Thorne, in an adjacent corridor less than 5 minutes before the Gamma-9 event. His proximity is a statistical anomaly we cannot ignore." Vespera's blood ran cold. "Thorne?" "His expertise is in neural mapping. His psychological profile shows a fixation on the persistence of consciousness. He is a person of interest, an unstable variable." The commander's gaze flickered back to her. "You have proven your efficiency and your adherence to protocol, technician, despite your philosophical query." The faintest trace of a threat hung in the air. "You will be his variable. You are assigned to monitor Dr. Thorne. Full sensory and network surveillance. Log his movements, his communications, his contacts. I want to know what he seeks in the dark of the lower levels." He was making her complicit. He was taking the doubt she had just shown and chaining it to this new task. A punishment and a test, all in one. If she questioned the firm hand, she would now be tasked to guide it. "You will not engage. You will not interfere. You will simply be a shadow, a silent observer. The great stillness requires no less." The weight of the order settled on her shoulders, heavier than any physical burden. She was no longer just an observer of suppression. She was an instrument of it. The path to her own perfect stillness was now paved with the surveillance of another man's grief. "I understand, Commander," she said again. There was nothing else to say. "Dismissed." She turned and walked out of the office, the steel door sliding shut behind her, sealing her in with her new purpose. As she stepped back into the grav lift to descend into the station's decaying art, the synthesized lilac of the spire felt more suffocating than the ossuary's honest stench of decay. She was an architect's tool now, polished and sharp, and pointed directly at the haunted heart of Dr. Aris Thorne.
The air in the Rust Gardens market was thick enough to drink, a foul cocktail of wet metal, mildewed algae, and the sweet, cloying reek of frying synth protein. Roldar Brecker kept his head down, his worn greatcoat pulled tight against the damp chill that seeped from the corroded iron walkways. The constant low hum of failing life support was the station's heartbeat, a rhythm punctuated here by the sizzle of nutrient paste on hot plates and the low murmur of illicit trade. He moved with a scavenger's economy of motion, his eyes never settling, always scanning the shifting shadows cast by flickering holographic advertisements for synthetic nutrients and memory-scrubbing services. He slipped into a narrow alcove behind a stall selling repurposed ventilation filters. The space smelled of ozone and rust. Here, bolted to the weeping bulkhead, was his destination, a black market terminal. It was a Frankenstein's monster of scavenged parts, its casing scarred and its screen filmed with grime. A thick cable, jury-rigged and sparking faintly, snaked from its base into a junction box overhead, stealing power from the station's grid. This was a place for ghosts and whispers, a conduit into the digital underbelly of Aethelgard, far from the polished surveillance of the architects. He pulled a greasy rag from his pocket and wiped a clean patch on the screen. His own reflection stared back, a gaunt face etched with the lines of loss and perpetual suspicion. The radiation that permeated the gardens had stolen the color from his hair, leaving it a washed-out gray. It had stolen more than that, of course. It had stolen his daughter. The thought was a familiar cold stone in his gut. He pushed it down. Survival was the only law that mattered now. With a gloved finger, Roldar tapped a sequence on the terminal's sticky keypad. The screen flickered to life, not with the elegant interface of the Veridia Spire, but with a stark, text-only command prompt. Green letters crawled across the black void. Robotic, sys proxy chain _ active, 17 hops, secure. Robotic, authenticating, CLIENT, RUSTWOLF, 734. Welcome.
He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The broker was online. Known only as Synapse, they were a legend in the black market, a faceless entity that dealt in the station's most dangerous commodity, information. Trusting Synapse was like trusting a venomous serpent not to bite, but Hrodar had no other choice. The data chip in his pocket felt impossibly heavy. He began to type, his movements deliberate. Every keystroke was a risk. Initiate query. Hrodar paused, his finger hovering over the keypad. He was about to reach out to a man who represented everything he despised, an academic, a former technocrat, a man whose ambition had reportedly cost him everything. But Thorne was also the station's foremost, and now only, expert in xenoneurology. He was the only one who could possibly understand the fragment of impossibly complex code Hrodar had found. A calculated risk, the only kind worth taking. Seeking contact. Subject, Thorne, Aris, disgraced. Current location, Veridia Spire. A long moment of silence followed. The only sound was the drip of condensation onto the metal floor and the faint, rhythmic clang of a distant maintenance drone. Hrodar's knuckles were white. He resisted the urge to look over his shoulder. Query received. Subject is high risk. Architect interest is sensitive. Fee X3 standard. Non-negotiable. Hrodar grimaced. 3 times the standard fee. It would nearly empty his account of echoes. The broker was a vulture, as always. But the speed of the reply, the immediate mention of the architects, it confirmed his suspicion. Thorne wasn't just disgraced, he was watched. This made him both more dangerous and more valuable. He thought of the chip, of the swirling, chaotic data patterns he'd glimpsed before the encryption locked him out. It felt like a recording of a nightmare. He had to know what it was worth. He had to take something back from this rotting station.
Fee accepted. Require secure, untraceable introduction. Justification required. State nature of artifact. The broker was fishing. Standard procedure. Give them a taste, but not the whole meal. Rodar chose his words as carefully as he would pick his way through a collapsed tunnel. Possession of data artifact. Authentic. Origin unknown. Pre-harmonization structure. It concerns resonance.
He typed the last word and held his breath. Resonance. The great taboo. The official story was that it was a system glitch, a ghost in the Ossuary's machinery. But the whispers in the dark corners of Ethelgard told a different story. And the data on Herolgar's chip didn't feel like a glitch. It felt alive. The screen remained blank. 10 seconds. 20. The hum of the terminal seemed to grow louder, filling the small alcove. Had he gone too far? Was a suppression squad already on their way, homing in on the power drain? His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. He was an echo-lost fool. He should have just sold the chip for parts. Then, new text appeared. The broker's tone had shifted. The robotic professionalism was still there, but beneath it, Heroldar could sense the digital equivalent of a predator catching a scent. Interest acknowledged. High value. Proceed. Initiating payment. Transfer complete. Coordinates follow. Rust Gardens. Level Gamma. Hydroponics Sector 9. Maintenance Conduit 4B Eta. Time 2 rotations. Subject will be there. Use codename Lyra. Lyra. Heroldar's blood ran cold. He knew the name. Everyone on Ethelgard knew the name. Aris Thorne's dead wife. The reason for his disgrace. Using her name as a password. It was cruel. It was personal. It was a perfect piece of psychological leverage to ensure Thorne would listen. Synapse wasn't just a broker. They were an artist of human weakness. This transaction is now erased. Stillness upon you. The screen went blank. The terminal's fan whirred for a moment longer before sputtering into silence. The stolen connection was severed. Heroldar stood motionless in the alcove, the market's noise slowly bleeding back into his awareness. He felt the smooth, cold plastic of the data chip through the fabric of his pocket. It was no longer just a potential payday. It was a key he was about to hand to a broken man in the hope of unlocking a door he couldn't even see. The calculated risk had solidified into a heavy, cold certainty. The die was cast. Tense anticipation coiled in his stomach, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It felt horribly like hope.
He pushed himself out of the alcove, melting back into the anonymous flow of the crowd. The bioluminescent fungi growing in the cracks of the ceiling cast an eerie, ethereal glow, illuminating the slow decay of Ethelgard. For the first time in a long time, Roldar Brecker felt like he was a part of it, not just a survivor picking at its bones, but an active agent in its inevitable, terrifying collapse. The chime was an intrusion, a single, sharp note slicing through the monotonous hum of the habitation unit. It was a sound Aris hadn't heard in months. Personal communiques were a relic, a risk few on Ethelgard were willing to take. He sat motionless in the gloom,
his apartment in the Veridia Spire little more than a stone-lined coffin with a cracked view of the station's decaying spine. Faded gold filigree, meant to evoke old-world grandeur, peeled from the damp walls like sunburnt skin. The air, thick with the metallic tang of recycled water and the sweet, cloying scent of the station's failing air scrubbers, felt heavy in his lungs. Beneath it all, the phantom smell of formaldehyde clung to his clothes, a permanent souvenir from the ossuary levels. He stared at the terminal. A single, unadorned text box pulsed on the screen, a lone beacon in a sea of his own half-finished research notes. His first instinct was academic, cold, and immediate. Ignore it. This was a probe, a test from the architects. They had seen him at the ossuary suppression. They had noted his unauthorized interest in the resonance event. This was the next logical step in their protocol. Present the subject with the temptation and observe their response. Condemnation through curiosity. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, biological rhythm at odds with the station's steady, dying drone. He could feel the familiar crawl of paranoia up his spine. The walls, already too close, seemed to press inward. Every shadow held a listening device. Every flicker of the emergency lighting was a camera shutter. To even acknowledge the message was to admit guilt.
They're lying about the ossuary event. The data signature wasn't a glitch. It was a response. I have the chip, uncorrupted. From one of their suppression units, it contains the raw resonance capture. You want to know what it really said? This isn't a question. Aris read the lines again, and a third time. His disciplined mind, the part of him that was still Dr. Thorne, the xenobiologist, catalogued the flags, the blunt declarative statements, the presumptive arrogance, the impossibly specific bait. It was a perfect trap, designed by someone who understood the precise shape of his obsession. And yet, a response. The word echoed in the silent chamber of his skull. That's what it had felt like. Not a random burst of neurostatic, not a system error. When that pod had activated, when the echo of the deceased had manifested on the observation screen, it hadn't felt like a ghost. It had felt like a reply to a question he hadn't known he was asking. A question that had been screaming inside him since Lyra, since the expedition, since the accident. He pushed himself away from the desk, the worn casters of his chair groaning in protest. He paced the small space, 3 steps one way, 3 steps back. The cracked synth glass window showed him nothing but the oppressive bulk of a neighboring spire, its Gothic arches picked out in the intermittent flash of a dying neon advertisement. A city of tombstones floating in an endless graveyard. "This is insane," he whispered to the empty room. His voice was a dry rasp. "It's a trap. They'll take me for harmonization, erase me. I'll become another echo-lost case, a cautionary tale whispered in the service corridors." He ran a hand over his face. The logic was irrefutable. The risk was absolute. But logic hadn't been in control for a very long time. Not since he'd held Lyra's hand as the alien biotoxin did its work, a consequence of his own reckless ambition, his need to push one step further than was safe. He had sacrificed her for a discovery that turned to ash in his hands. What was one more risk now? He stopped in front of a small digital frame on his desk. It was the only personal item he allowed himself, a still image of Lyra, taken years ago. She was laughing, her head thrown back, the light of a star they were studying caught in her eyes. It wasn't an authentic memory, not really, just a collection of pixels, a data file. But it was all he had left of the truth of her.
The great stillness the architects preached was just a euphemism for the silence she had left behind. The raw resonance capture, the words from the message pulsed in his mind's eye. What if it wasn't just a random echo? The thought was a venomous hope, a serpent coiling around the base of his skull. What if resonance wasn't an anomaly, but a medium, a way for the patterns to persist? What if understanding it, truly understanding it, was the only penance that mattered, the only way to reverse the equation of his guilt? The science was a lie, he told himself. The truth was simpler and far more damning. He wanted to hear her voice again, even a ghost of it, even a lie. He sat back down, his movements stiff, deliberate. His caution was a thin, brittle shell. Grief was the hammer. He could feel the moment it shattered. The message prompt was still there, a blinking cursor awaiting a reply. There was no text field, only two options, stark and binary. Decline. Accept. His hand trembled as it hovered over the controls. He could feel the cold sweat on his neck. He thought of the architects, of their sterile white chambers, and the dead-eyed placidity of those who had undergone harmonization. He thought of Vespera Lyrian, the technician he'd seen at the suppression, her face a mask of disciplined certainty. He thought of the absolute, crushing silence of his life. Then he thought of Lyra's laugh, and the choice was no longer a choice at all. His finger jabbed the panel. Accept. For a moment, nothing happened. The station hummed on. The neon across the void flickered and died, then flickered back to life. He held his breath, expecting security overrides, the shriek of an alarm, the heavy thud of mag boots in the corridor outside. Instead, a new line of text appeared on the screen. Robotic. Rust Gardens Maintenance Shaft 7 Gamma, Filtration Sector, 1 cycle from now. The message then added one final chilling line. Robotic. Come alone. Don't trust the voice in your head, especially if it sounds like hers.
The screen went blank. The terminal returned to his own scattered notes, as if the entire exchange had been a hallucination. But the location, the time, the warning, they were burned into his retinas. His heart was still hammering, but the frantic rhythm of fear had changed. It was now the driving beat of reckless, terrible resolve. He had made his gamble. The only thing left was to see the cards.
Her duty was simple, spelled out in the architect's own unyielding logic. Isolate the signal, dispatch a suppression team, and erase the anomaly. A clean, efficient excision of a potential tumor. Stillness upon all. But the report would be incomplete. The why would be lost in the sterile hum of a harmonization field. The architects valued control, but they craved knowledge even more. To destroy the data without first understanding it was wasteful. Authorize primary decryption, she spoke, her voice a low monotone. Override brute force protocols. Employ recursive analysis, slow slice method. A holographic lattice of shimmering code materialized above her console, a spinning globe of tangled light. The system began its work, peeling back the layers of encryption one by one. It was like watching a surgeon dissect a living nerve. The code fought back, creating ghost signals and false pathways. It was elegant, protective. Vespera leaned forward, her professional detachment fraying at the edges. This was not a smuggler's tool. This was a key, designed to open a very specific lock. She watched the machine work,
her own mind a parallel processor. Thorne's recent activity log scrolled in a secondary window. His authorized access to ossuary-level data, his repeated queries on resonance events, his obsession with the failed Kepler 186F expedition. He was chasing ghosts, his wife's ghost most likely, an emotional disruption the harmonizer should have cauterized years ago. Such sentimentality was a sickness. A lock icon on the holographic sphere fractured, then dissolved. The first layer was breached. Decryption, 34%. Fragments appeared. Not a message, but coordinates. A location tag for maintenance conduit 9 Gamma, a derelict passage that snaked through the skeletal underbelly of the station, bordering the rust gardens, a place no one went, a place officially decommissioned a century ago. Below the coordinates, a simple timestamp, a rendezvous. Her console chimed again, this time with more urgency. Cross-referencing handshake protocol. Counterparty signal origin identified. Rust Gardens sector. Class Dreg. The pieces clicked into place with a cold, unsettling finality. The disgraced academic and the scavenger. A technocrat and a dreg. An impossible intersection of the station's rigid castes. Her system, devoid of nuance, flashed a new assessment in stark block letters.
Threat analysis. Unauthorized data transfer. Potential ideological contamination. Priority high. Recommend immediate dispatch of suppression team. Her hand hovered over the command icon, her index finger trembling almost imperceptibly. This was the moment. The prescribed path. Press the button, and 2 lives would be overwritten. 2 threads of inquiry would be snipped and discarded. The disruption would end. The great stillness would be preserved. She straightened up, her decision made. It was a deviation, a subtle but profound betrayal of protocol. It was a risk, but a calculated one. An experiment. Log suppression request, she commanded, her voice firm. Team Epsilon, assigned to staging area Delta 7, Ossuary perimeter. Hold for deployment on my mark. Authorization, Lyrian V, Zeta. The system complied without question. Suppression request logged. Team Epsilon on standby. She had created her safety net, a firebreak, ready to be deployed if her observation went wrong. But she would not give the signal from the safety of her chair. To truly understand the threat, she had to witness it. She had to see the look in Thorne's eyes, see what a dreg looked like when he believed he held the key to a mystery. Vespera blanked her screens and rose from her chair. The sudden absence of their blue glow plunged the room into the dim, moody amber of the corridor's emergency lighting. The Gothic shadows of her station hardware stretched long and distorted across the walls. She pulled on the simple, gray technician's overcoat, the fabric cool and anonymous. It concealed the slim profile of the neural disruption sidearm holstered at her hip, a tool of last resort. Her fingers brushed against the compact interface cuff on her left wrist, her tether to the system, to control. Stepping out of the outpost, the station's sounds became more present, the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of condensation from a stained ceiling pipe, the distant mournful clang of a maintenance drone in a service shaft. A faint ethereal patch of bioluminescent fungi pulsed with a soft green light from a crack in the wall, illuminating the grime.
She was no longer an observer watching a river of data. She was a stone about to be dropped into its current. She moved with purpose, her soft sole boots making no sound on the corroded metal deck plates. Stillness upon them all, she thought. But first she would watch them move. The air in the derelict hydroponics bay was thick enough to chew. It clung to the back of Aris's throat, a composite of wet rot, rust, and the cloying sweetness of decay that had nothing to do with the formaldehyde perfume of the ossuary. Here, death was organic, grinding, and slow. Dust motes, thick as insects, danced in the single beam of his hand-held lumen, illuminating the skeletal remains of what were once lush, life-giving vines. Now they were just gray, brittle claws reaching from dry, cracked soil beds, grasping for a light that had died a century ago. He felt exposed. Every scrape of his boot on the corroded metal walkway seemed to echo for miles. This was not his world of sterile observation rooms and silent sleeping pods. This was the station's gut, the rust gardens, a place of forgotten machinery and forgotten people. Lyra's face swam in his mind, her features coalescing from the dancing dust. Ambition, Aris. It leads you to the strangest, darkest places. He squeezed his eyes shut, pushing her away. She wasn't real, not here, not yet. You look lost, scholar. The voice was a rasp of rust and disuse, coming from the shadows to his left. Aris flinched, his lumen beam jerking wildly before finding the source. A man unfolded himself from a nest of dead conduits, moving with a fluid economy that spoke of a lifetime spent in cramped, dangerous spaces. He was gaunt but wiry. His face was a collection of sharp angles and suspicion, framed by a matted tangle of dark hair. His clothes were a patchwork of scavenged materials, and a faint, acrid smell of ozone and irradiated dust followed him. This was Haroldar Brecker. "I was told you had something for me," Aris said, his own voice sounding thin and reedy in the cavernous space.
Haroldar stepped fully into the light, his eyes flicking from Aris's face to his hands, to the clean, well-maintained fabric of his coat. A flicker of contempt crossed his features. "I have a piece of data, you have a payment. Let's not pretend this is a meeting of minds." He held out a grimy hand. 500 echoes, as agreed. Aris's stomach tightened. 500 was nearly everything he had left, scrounged and traded for over weeks. He couldn't afford for this to be a trick. He couldn't afford for it not to be the truth. "Let me see it first." Haroldar gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "Stillness upon you, scholar, but you must be echo-lost. That's not how this works. You pay, I give. Then we walk away and forget we ever saw each other." "This isn't some black market implant or a ration card," Aris argued, taking a step forward, his desperation overriding his caution. "This is about resonance. This could be everything. I need to know it's legitimate." "It's a data chip. It's as legitimate as the rust on these walls," Haroldar retorted, his patience wearing thin. His hand remained outstretched. "The information is what it is. Its value to you is your problem, not mine. The price for my risk is fixed. The echoes." The two men stood in a tense standoff, a microcosm of Ethelgard itself, the desperate, hopeful academic against the hardened, cynical survivor.
The air crackled with their opposing philosophies. For Aris, this data was a key, a path to redemption, a way to understand the ghost of his wife that whispered to him from the station's dead. For Haraldar, it was just another transaction in a long, weary life of them, a means to survive another cycle. "I can't," Aris said, the words tasting like ash. "I won't, not until I see something." He expected Haraldar to turn and melt back into the shadows, the opportunity lost forever. He expected a threat. Instead, the scavenger stared at him for a long, silent moment. With a sigh of profound irritation, Haraldar finally lowered his hand. "You technocrats are all the same. You think the universe owes you an explanation." He reached into a pocket and pulled out a small, battered data pad, its casing scarred and its screen crazed with a spiderweb of cracks. With a practiced thumb, he swiped it to life. "You get one look, one, then you pay." He held the data pad out. The screen glowed a sickly amber, illuminating a fragment of an architect incident report. It was mostly redacted jargon, system codes, and unit designations. Aris's eyes scanned it frantically, his heart pounding against his ribs. It was meaningless noise, a jumble of... And then he saw it. 2 words, stark and unredacted, next to an event timestamp that matched the resonance surge he had witnessed in the ossuary. 2 words that ripped the foundation of his world apart. Raldar's device spoke the line in a flat, synthesized voice as Aris's finger hovered over the text. "Event classification. Containment failure." Aris froze. The dripping water, the hum of distant machinery, the very air in his lungs, it all ceased to exist. There was only the text, burning itself onto his retinas. Containment. Not anomaly, not glitch, not unforeseen psychic event. Containment. It was a word of profound and terrifying implication. It implied a vessel, a barrier. It implied something was being held, something that was never meant to be free. The official narrative from the architects, that resonance was a harmless, unfortunate side effect of the neural network's decay, a form of signal degradation, was a lie, a carefully constructed station-wide lie. And failure. They had failed. What he had seen, what he had felt, was not the system breaking down. It was something else breaking out. The echoes of the dead were not ghosts in the machine. They were prisoners escaping the ruins of their own minds. Lyra, her voice, her face, was she a prisoner? The thought hit him with the force of a physical blow. The nature of his quest shifted in that instant. He was no longer just a scientist chasing a phenomenon. He was a man staring at the lock of a prison, and the ghost of his wife was trapped inside.
Haraldar watched the cascade of emotions on Aris's face. Confusion, dawning horror, and then something else. The pleading desperation vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp intensity. The scholar's soft, fearful eyes had hardened into chips of obsidian. "All right," Haraldar said, snatching the datapad back. "You've seen it. Now, the echoes." Aris looked up, his gaze locking onto Haraldar's. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Haraldar still had the chip, but Aris now possessed the context, the terrible, magnificent truth of what it meant. "That's not enough," Aris said, his voice a low, steady whisper that carried more weight than any shout. "That's a fragment, an abstract. I need the source file. I need the telemetry, the logs, the unredacted reports. I need all of it." Hroldar stared, taken aback by the sudden authority in Aris's tone. That wasn't the deal. The deal has changed, Aris stated, his scientific mind now racing, calculating, connecting points of data he hadn't even known were related. This is bigger than 500 echoes. This is bigger than you and me. This is about the foundation of this entire station. He took a breath, the rotten air no longer bothering him. His focus was absolute. Tell me what you want. Not echoes. Tell me what you really want. The air in the derelict hydroponics bay was thick enough to drink, a humid cocktail of decaying algae and the sharp metallic tang of leaking coolant. Each drop of condensation that fell from the corroded ceiling beams landed with a fat, echoing plink, a maddening water clock marking our failure. We were cornered. Hiding in the rust gardens, the station's festering gut felt less like a strategic retreat and more like the final crawl of a wounded animal. Hroldar stood by the bay's shattered observation window, a hulking silhouette against the faint, ethereal glow of the bioluminescent fungi clinging to the outer hull. He hadn't spoken in an hour, his stillness a monument to grim acceptance. The disastrous end of the heist, the trap, the blinding lights, and the gut punch of Wulfric's betrayal, and the image of Valerius bound and broken, had cauterized what little hope we'd nurtured. We had escaped the Ossuary lockdown by plunging into the station's service tunnels, a desperate flight through darkness and filth, but we hadn't escaped the truth. We had lost, utterly.
My attention was welded to the data slate in my lap. In the chaos, in the frantic scramble from the vault, I had managed to palm a secondary data chip from a peripheral console. Not the main archive, not the foundational lie we'd sought, but something, a breadcrumb, a final, desperate lottery ticket. Its encryption was a nightmare, an architect's knot of interlocking security protocols designed to self-destruct if tampered with. But Valerius had taught me the theory, the back doors built into the system's own arrogance. My fingers, slick with sweat and grime, danced over the slate's holographic interface. My own reflection stared back from the dark screen, a gaunt specter with hollowed eyes. Echo lost. The curse felt more real than ever. Lyra's whisper was a constant hum beneath my thoughts, a sub-vocalization of my own grief. Almost there, Aris. Don't stop now.
Anything! Hroldar's voice was a gravelly rasp, pulling me from the hypnotic flow of code.
It's fighting back, I murmured, my eyes not leaving the cascading strings of data. The outer layers are like spar tissue, brittle but layered deep.
So another dead end?
It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact from a man who dealt only in them.
No!
The word was sharp, defensive. The architects build their systems on a paradox of control. They believe in absolute order, but life is chaos. Their code mimics their philosophy, but it has to interface with a universe that doesn't obey. There's always a flaw, a hairline fracture. I could feel Hroldar stare on my back, heavy with the weight of his skepticism. He had sacrificed the most to get us this far, trusting me, trusting Vespera. And for what? To be trapped in the station's septic tank with a ghost and a madman chasing a whisper on a chip? Then I saw it. A recursive loop, elegant and vicious, designed to trap any unauthorized user in an infinite cycle. But within its perfection was the flaw, a single timing call that referenced an outdated chronometer protocol, one from before the Great Stillness was codified. It was an artifact,
A fossil. A key. And then, as if a dam had burst, the red vanished. The screen went black. A single line of pristine white text blinked into existence in the center of the slate. K186XN E Botanical Assay _7. It was real. My hand trembled. I navigated the directory, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline. Filed trees blossomed on the screen, not the sanitized, redacted histories of the architect archives, but raw, unadulterated data. Chemical compositions, spectrographic analyses, field notes logged with dates that preceded the official founding of Ethelgard. It was a piece of the original sin, the true history of the Kepler 186F colony, the very thing the architects had built their silent empire to bury. Hroldar, I breathed, the name a prayer. I'm in! It's here! It's all here! A smile, the first genuine one in months, cracked the dry skin of my lips. I looked up from the slate's glow, my face aching with the unfamiliar expression. The exhilaration was a physical shock, a jolt of pure, undiluted triumph that burned away the filth and the fear. We hadn't failed. This was it. This was the proof. This was the beginning of their end. We did it! Hroldar turned from the window, his craggy face unreadable in the dim fungal light. He took a step toward me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something other than bitter resignation in his eyes, a spark of the same fire I felt. Then came the sound, a soft pneumatic hiss that cut through the rhythmic dripping like a blade. It was the sound of a seal being broken, the sound of a tomb being opened. My smile evaporated. The blood in my veins turned to ice. Hroldar froze, his hand dropping to the heavy wrench tucked in his belt. We both spun toward the bay's main entrance, a massive circular door we had manually sealed hours ago. A line of brilliant, sterile white light appeared around the door's circumference. With a low, powerful groan, the heavy metal slid sideways, retracting into the wall. The sudden flood of light was an assault, blinding and absolute. It bleached the eerie bioluminescence to nothing, incinerating our shadows. 3 figures stood silhouetted against the glare. 2 were unmistakable. Architect enforcers, clad in the sleek black carapace of their combat armor, pulse rifles held at a low, casual ready. Their presence was an immediate death sentence.
But it was the figure in the middle that made my world tilt on its axis. Smaller, unarmored, standing with a stillness that was both rigid and absolute. As my eyes adjusted, the silhouette resolved into a face I knew as well as my own, the Sparrow. Her face was a pale, emotionless mask. Her dark hair was pulled back with severe precision. She wore the stark gray tunic of a mid-level architect technician, clean and perfectly pressed. The desperate, conflicted woman who had sabotaged her own people to help us was gone. In her place stood a stranger, a sentinel of the great stillness. The exhilaration of a moment ago curdled into a thick, suffocating dread that clogged my throat. This wasn't a rescue. This was a reckoning. "Stillness upon you, Dr. Thorne," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of any inflection, any memory of our alliance. It was the voice she might use to report a system malfunction. "Stillness upon you, Citizen Brecker. Your unsanctioned activity has been logged." The enforcers moved with silent, practiced efficiency. There was no shouting, no struggle. Hroldar didn't even have time to raise his wrench before one of them was on him, a pressure point applied to his neck that made the giant of a man grunt and sag. The other stepped towards me.
I didn't resist. My limbs felt disconnected, filled with lead. My mind was reeling, scrambling to reconcile the Vespera I knew with the cold automaton standing before me. Vespera, what? The words were a choked whisper. She didn't answer. She didn't even look at me. Her gaze was fixed on the data slate still glowing in my hands. The enforcer beside me plucked it from my grasp with insulting gentleness. He presented it to her. She took it, her eyes scanning the screen. For a fleeting instant, I thought I saw a flicker in her expression, a twitch, a shadow of conflict as she saw the decrypted file name. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the same placid emptiness. With a final decisive tap on the screen, she initiated a white protocol. The white text, our single shining victory, dissolved into a cascade of meaningless, corrupt code before the screen went dark. "Confiscated," she stated to the enforcer. "Log it as volatile contraband."
They hauled Hroldar to his feet, his face a thunderous mask of betrayal. They pulled me up beside him, my legs barely held. All I could do was stare at her, searching for a sign, a tell, anything to prove that our ally was still in there. I found nothing, only the calm, chilling certainty of the architects. She turned, her back to us, and walked into the sterile light of the corridor. "Proceed with the transfer to the ossuary," she commanded, her voice echoing in the bay. "Level 7. Harmonization protocol is authorized." The holding cell was a void made solid. White walls, white floor, white ceiling, all composed of a seamless polymer that absorbed sound and gave nothing back. It was a space designed to unmake a person before the tools were even brought out. From the narrow observation window, Vespera Lyrian watched the two disparate figures contained within. One, the scavenger from the rust gardens, sat on the room's single sterile bench, Hroldar Brecker. His clothes were a tapestry of grime and repair, his face a mask of bored contempt. He hadn't stopped drumming a grimy finger against his knee since they'd brought him in. The other, the disgraced xenobiologist, Dr. Aris Thorne, was a wreck. He paced the 3-meter length of the cell, his lab coat stained and rumpled, his hands twisting in front of him as if trying to wring the memory of something from his very bones. A classic case of resonance sensitivity, perhaps, or just raw terror. Vespera felt the familiar cold knot of professional duty tighten in her stomach. These were contaminants, unscheduled variables in the carefully balanced equation of Ethelgard's survival. Her job was to identify, report, and let the system correct. Stillness was the goal. Always. She keyed the panel, and the cell door hissed open. The recycled air within, scrubbed clean of the station's usual sense of decay and ozone, felt thin and dead in her lungs. Both men flinched at the sound. Hroldar looked up, a smirk playing on his chapped lips. Aris froze mid-stride, his eyes wide and haunted. "Enjoying the accommodations?" Vespera asked, her voice flat, the practiced tone of authority she had spent years perfecting. She stepped inside, the door sliding shut behind her with a definite thud. Hroldar let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "It's a bit clean for my taste, lacks character. And the ever-present threat of a radiation leak, I almost feel homesick." His gaze flickered to Aris. "This one, though, he seems to like it. A blank slate for a blank mind. Isn't that right, Doctor? Getting a bit echo-lost?" Aris flinched as if struck. "I'm not," he stammered, his voice thin. We weren't doing anything. You were meeting in a restricted service corridor near an ossuary access point, Vespera stated, ignoring Roldar's jab. She kept her focus on Aris, the weaker link. That, Dr. Thorne, is an action. What was its purpose? Inside, a different voice, her own, was asking more dangerous questions. Why was a Dreg scavenger near the ossuary? What did he find? The official report on the last resonance event had been tidy, too tidy. A system malfunction, a localized energy spike. It didn't account for the fragmented data signature she had detected before the suppression team wiped the logs. I was lost, Aris said, his gaze skittering away from hers. This station, it's a maze. I was just trying to get my bearings. Lost, Hroldar snorted. Yes, of course. He was looking for the Grand Library. The man who maps the dead brains of alien squids can't read a station schematic. Makes perfect sense. Vespera's eyes narrowed. And you, scavenger, what was your purpose? Salvage, Hroldar said with a shrug. It's what I do. Your cleanup crew is sloppy. They drop things. The unspoken threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He had found something. The data chip. Her instinct screamed it. The quiet defiance in his posture, the calculated insolence. It wasn't the bluster of a common criminal. It was the confidence of a man holding a valuable card. There is nothing of value in the service corridors, she said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. Depends on what you value, architect, Hroldar replied, his eyes glinting. Some people value truth. That was it. The word landed like a stone in the placid pool of her conditioning. Truth. A dangerous, corrosive concept on Aethelgard. The great stillness was built on the serene comfort of its absence. She had to end this, now.
The conversation is over, she announced, turning her back on them and stepping out of the cell. The door sealed them away again. Her heart was beating a fraction too fast. She pressed a hand to her chest, forcing a slow, measured breath. Calm, order, stillness. The mantra felt hollow. She moved to the secure comms panel on the wall, the cool metal a stark contrast to her clammy palm. She keyed in her authorization, and the air before her shimmered, coalescing into the severe, placid face of Proctor Korvac. His features were sharp, his eyes a pale, dispassionate gray. He was the embodiment of the architect's ideal, emotion scrubbed clean, leaving only cold, perfect logic. Technician Lyrian, his voice was a synthesized baritone, smooth and without inflection. Report. Proctor, she began, her voice a perfect replica of his own detached calm. Subjects are secured. The Dreg, Hroldor Brecker, is uncooperative but predictable. The xenobiologist, Dr. Thorne, exhibits signs of neural stress, consistent with proximity to the malfunction. She chose the word carefully. Korvac sought it a moment, a digital ghost in the machine, processing her words, her tone, the fractional hesitation before malfunction. And the purpose of their meeting. Undetermined. The Dreg claims salvage. The doctor claims he was lost. And you believe them? This was the test. The real interrogation wasn't happening inside the cell. It was happening right here. Their stories are irrelevant, Proctor. Their unsanctioned meeting in a restricted zone is sufficient cause for harmonization. Another pause, longer this time. Medium pause. Vespera could feel the hum of the station's life support,
a constant low thrum against her bones. It suddenly felt like a countdown. "There is a tremor in your report, technician," Korvac said, his gaze unblinking. "A lack of conviction. The great stillness is not merely a state to be observed. It is an act to be performed, a discipline to be maintained." Vespera's blood ran cold. "My conviction is absolute, Proctor." "Then you will reaffirm it," he said, the words as soft as silk and as strong as steel. "You will personally administer the neural harmonization, both subjects, immediately." The air left her lungs. Her mind, usually a fortress of organized procedure and logical trees, became a maelstrom. This was not protocol. Technicians of her grade were analysts, observers. The hands-on work was for suppression teams, for the faceless orderlies in the medical bays. It was a messy, intimate act of violation, an erasure. She had seen the schematics, studied the theory, but she had never held the instrument, never been the one to press the button that snuffed out a piece of a person's soul. Proctor," she managed, her voice tight. "With respect, my duties are analytical. A standard harmonization team is on standby and better equipped." "Your duty is to the order," Korvac cut her off, the warmth evaporating from his voice, leaving only the chill of command. "And the order commands you. Consider this a practical lesson in the purity of our purpose. You will find the experience clarifying." His image flickered. "Stillness upon you, Vespera." The connection severed, leaving Vespera alone in the silent corridor. The hum of the station seemed to roar in her ears. A lesson, a test, a punishment for a crime she hadn't even committed yet, the crime of doubt. Her gaze drifted to the wall beside the comms panel. Behind a thin metal plate was the harmonization kit, standard issue, a compact power cell, a set of adhesive neural conductors, and the applicator, a sleek, pen-like device with a needle-fine tip designed to interface with a subject's cortical implant port. She reached out, her fingers trembling almost imperceptibly, and popped the cover plate. The kit was cold to the touch. She lifted the applicator. It felt unnaturally heavy, a dense, terrible weight in her hand, a tool for imposing quiet, a weapon for murdering memory. She looked through the observation window again. Hroldar was watching her, his smirk gone, replaced by a wary, knowing look. Aris had collapsed onto the floor, his head in his hands, rocking back and forth. They weren't subjects anymore. They weren't variables. They were about to become her sin. Gripping the harmonizer until her knuckles turned white, Vespera took a single, deliberate step toward the cell door. The order had been given, and on Aethelgard, an order was absolute.
The chair was cold, not just the ambient chill of Aethelgard that seeped into everything, but a deep vampiric cold that seemed to draw the warmth directly from Aris's flesh. It was a throne of punishment, its frame of tarnished brass and dark-pitted steel curving around him like a skeletal hand. A final, authoritative click echoed in the sterile chamber as a magnetic restraint locked over his sternum. Helplessness was a physical weight. To his left, Hroldar Brecker sat in an identical chair, his jaw set, his weathered face a mask of contemptuous granite. The scavenger's gaze was fixed on the woman moving between them. "Make sure you get my good side," Proldar rasped, the sound swallowed by the room's oppressive quiet. "Wouldn't want to forget this fine hospitality." Vespera Lyrian didn't answer. She didn't even look at them. Aris recognized her from the ossuary, the same severe, dark uniform of an architect-technician, the same tightly bound hair, the same pale, disciplined features. But the composure he'd seen then was gone, replaced by a brittle, over-precise tension. Her movements were stiff, her hands arranging instruments on a floating tray with the jerky efficiency of an automaton. The chamber itself was a monument to the architect's ideology. Vaulted Gothic ceilings arched high into shadow, their lines intended for inspiration but now serving only to amplify the sense of being trapped at the bottom of a well. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and a sharp antiseptic tang that failed to cover the station's ubiquitous, cloying sweetness of decay. Patches of faint blue bioluminescent fungi pulsed dimly behind a ventilation grate near the floor, the only organic warmth in a room dedicated to inorganic peace. Vespera picked up a neural crown, a circlet of metal filigree and crystalline nodes that glittered under the single focused beam of light illuminating the chairs. She approached Proldar first. He didn't flinch, just watched her with narrowed eyes as she fitted the device to his head. Her fingers, Aris noted, were steady. Too steady. "Don't go digging too deep," Proldar said, his voice lower now. "The good memories are buried under a lot of rust. You'll just cut yourself."
"Be still," Vespera murmured, her first words. The command was devoid of emotion, a pre-recorded statement. She adjusted a node above Hroldar's temple, her knuckles brushing his scarred skin. She recoiled from the contact as if burned, a micro-expression of distaste flashing across her face before the professional mask slammed back down. Then it was Aris's turn. She moved before him, and he was struck by the absence of her gaze. Her eyes were fixed on the crown in her hands, on his hairline, on the wall behind him, anywhere but his own. The smell of her, clean, sterile, devoid of perfume, filled his senses as she leaned in. Her proximity was a violation, an intimacy more profound than a physical blow. He was not a person to her. He was a terminal to be accessed, a file to be corrupted and erased. He thought of Lyra. The memory was a sharp, physical ache behind his ribs. Her face laughing in the simulated sunlight of a habitat long since decommissioned. The specific warmth of her hand in his. These were not just memories, they were the architecture of his soul. To have them scraped away, to be rendered echo-lost by this machine. The irony was a bitter acid in his throat. He, the man who hunted the ghosts of memory and dead alien minds, was about to become a ghost himself. "You saw it," Aris said, his voice tight. "In the ossuary. That wasn't a glitch. You know it wasn't." Vespera's hands paused for a fraction of a second. She did not look at him. She carefully placed the cold metal of the crown onto his head. The contact sent a shiver through him. "The procedure is routine," she stated, her voice a fragile monotone. "Neural harmonization ensures systemic stability and personal tranquility." "Is that what you call it?" Aris pressed, unable to stop himself. "Tranquility? Wiping a man clean because he saw something you can't explain? That's not stillness, that's cowardice." Her fingers tightened on the crown, pressing the nodes firmly against his skull. For a single charged moment, her eyes met his. He saw it then, Not malice, not cruelty, but a flicker of gut-wrenching turmoil. A drowning person staring out from behind the placid surface of a frozen lake. Then it was gone.
She straightened up and moved to the central console, a monolith of dark metal and holographic panels. Her spine was rigid. She was performing a role, one she had rehearsed 1,000 times, but the script was failing her. "Initiating sequence," she announced to the empty room. Her fingers danced across the console, their movements swift and sure, a stark contrast to the tremor in her jaw. The low ambient hum of the station's life support was suddenly joined by a new sound. It started as a deep, resonant thrum, a bass note that vibrated up from the floor, through the metal of the chair, and into Aris's bones. It was the sound of a great machine waking from a long slumber. The lights in the chamber dimmed, leaving only the cold blue-white glow of the console and the two neural crowns. The holographic displays shimmered, resolving into complex, shifting lattices of light, the visual representation of a mind about to be unwritten. Aris's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it, the end of the path. His obsessive quest had led him here, to an execution of the self. The guilt he carried for Lyra, the sharp-edged stone that had defined his existence since her death, it was about to be smoothed away, polished into nothing. And without it, would his love for her even remain? Or would she become just a name, a void where a universe of feeling used to be? The fear of that was worse than death. It was damnation. He glanced at Hroldar. The old scavenger had his eyes closed, his face grim. He looked like a man facing a firing squad, not with bravery, but with a weary resignation that was somehow more profound. Across the room, Vespera stood silhouetted against the glowing console. A single bead of sweat traced a path down her temple, catching the holographic light like a falling tear. Her hands were poised over the final activation panel, but they hesitated. She was staring at the shifting patterns on the screen, a torrent of data flowing from their minds into her machine. She was seeing them, not their faces, but the raw, unfiltered stuff of their lives.
Vesper's hand trembled visibly now. Her breath hitched. She was struggling, fighting a war within the confines of her own skull. Aris could only watch, pinned and powerless, as this stranger held his entire world in her shaking hand. "Stillness upon you," she recited, the words hollow, broken. It wasn't a blessing, it was a plea. She pressed the panel. The hum escalated into a clean, piercing tone. The light behind Aris's eyes exploded into a silent white scream. The neural harmonization chamber was Vespera's sanctuary, a place of immaculate order carved from Aethelgard's chronic decay. Here, the station's chaotic hum was filtered into a placid, low-frequency thrum. The air, scrubbed of the perpetual scent of ozone and rot, smelled of nothing at all, the scent of control. Polished chrome and obsidian-black composites reflected the cool, clinical light of the ceiling panels. It was a space dedicated to the great stillness, and Vespera was its priestess. Her subjects were already installed. In the twin harmonization chairs, Dr. Aris Thorne and the scavenger, Hroldar Brecker, were held fast by pneumatic restraints. Their transgression, unauthorized contact, the pursuit of forbidden knowledge, was a jagged edge, a dissonant chord in the station's fragile peace. Vespera's work was not a punishment, it was a kindness, a restoration. She moved with practiced efficiency around her console, her gloved fingers gliding across the cool glass interface. A series of soft chimes confirmed each diagnostic. Life signs, stable. Neural latency, within parameters. Memory buffer, empty and waiting. "The procedure will be brief," she stated, her voice calm and even, a carefully modulated instrument of reassurance. Her gaze flickered to the monitors displaying the subject's biometrics. Thorne's heart rate was a frantic bird beating against a cage. His eyes, wide and haunted, were fixed on the articulated emitters poised above his head. He looked like a man about to lose his soul. "You will feel a slight pressure at your temples, followed by a deep sense of peace. Do not resist it. Resistance only prolongs the discord." The scavenger, Brecker, merely grunted, a low, contemptuous sound. His defiance was a familiar frequency, the static of the dregs who mistook their chaotic memories for identity. Vespera ignored him. Stillness upon them both soon enough.
She keyed the final initiation sequence. Harmonization protocol commencing. Subject 1, Thorne, Aris. Subject 2, Brecker, Hroldar. Wiping recent engrams, targeting illicit data acquisition and associative emotional trauma. The hum of the chamber deepened. The articulated arms swiveled with silent grace, lowering the emitters until their polished tips hovered a centimeter from each man's temples. A clean, sterile blue-white light began to gather at the points. This was the moment of grace. The pure, targeted energy would gently decouple the offending memories, dissolving them into meaningless data fragments. The trauma, the conspiracy, the feverish paranoia, all would be washed away, leaving only a tranquil void. Aris Thorne would awaken feeling lighter, unburdened. He wouldn't remember why, and that was the gift. Vespera watched the energy capacitance meter climb. 80%, 90, 95. Her finger hovered over the discharge key. She took a quiet, centering breath. "Stillness upon you," she whispered to the unhearing room. Then the station groaned, a deep guttural sound that vibrated through the floor plates, a bass note of pure structural agony. The pristine white lights of the chamber flickered once, twice, and died. For a heartbeat, there was absolute blackness, the sterile hum replaced by a sudden, shocking silence. Then the emergency power kicked in. The chamber was plunged into the bloody, strobing wash of red alarm lights. A klaxon began to blare, a panicked, rhythmic shriek that grated against Vespera's teeth. "Station-wide power surge," she snapped, her hands flying across the console. This was a drill she'd practiced 100 times. "Aborting harmonization protocol." She pressed the emergency cutoff. The holographic display flickered, but the command was ignored. A red banner flashed across the screen. "Command lockout." A second one appeared beside it. "External system override." What? The word was a breath of disbelief. That was impossible. This system was a closed loop, the most secure network on Athelgard. Nothing got in.
On the main diagnostic panel, the capacitance meter wasn't falling, it was climbing. 100%, 110. A thin, high-pitched whine began to emanate from the emitters above the prisoners' heads, a sound like tearing metal. The pure blue-white light warped, sickened, shifting to a virulent, strobing green-gold, the color of bioluminescent fungi growing on a corpse. "Override alpha sequence, now!" she commanded the console, her voice losing its clinical edge, sharpened by a blade of rising panic. The machine didn't respond.
The whine intensified, climbing octaves until it was a physical pressure in her ears. The energy readings on her screen became a chaotic scribble. The numbers were nonsensical, impossibly high. The system wasn't just malfunctioning, it was being driven, force-fed a torrent of raw, unstructured energy from an unknown source. The faint, cloying sweetness of ozone began to fill the air, thick and acrid like burnt sugar in metal. She saw Thorne struggling against his restraints, his face a mask of pure terror. Even the scavenger looked unnerved, his cynical sneer replaced by a grimace of pain as the whining intensified. "Manual disengage!" Vespera slammed a physical red-cased button on the console. It was the hard kill switch, a direct mechanical sever. The button depressed with a useless click. Nothing. The system was utterly, completely hijacked. "Security! Get in here! Shut it down at the conduit!" She screamed toward the door, knowing they wouldn't hear her over the alarm. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a surge. Her blood ran cold. The data stream, it had a signature. It wasn't a random cascade of energy. It had a pattern. It was rhythmic, complex, hideously organic, like a heartbeat, like a voice screaming in a language the machine was struggling to translate. Resonance. The word bloomed in her mind, a black flower of horror. The ghost in the machine. It had been a distant problem, a low-level corruption the architects were methodically containing. It was never supposed to have this much power. It was never supposed to reach this deep into their system.
The whine reached an unbearable, glass-shattering crescendo. The sickly green-gold light at the emitters pulsed violently. Vespera stumbled back from the console, a strangled gasp caught in her throat. The machine wasn't wiping memory anymore. It was preparing to broadcast. It was using the harmonizer as an amplifier, and Aris Thorne and Heralder Brecker were the antennae. With a deafening crackle, like lightning striking inches away, two thick, unstable arcs of green-gold energy lashed out from the emitters. They did not touch the men's temples. They plunged directly into the neural interface ports at the base of their skulls. Aris Thorne's body went rigid, his back arching so violently the restraints groaned. A silent scream contorted his features. Brecker convulsed, a guttural roar torn from his throat. On the monitor, their neural activity flatlined for a nanosecond and was then replaced by something else. A new signal, a tidal wave of alien data, overwritten their own consciousness. It wasn't erasing, it was subsuming. Vespera could only stare, her perfectly ordered world collapsing into screaming, incomprehensible chaos. The klaxon wailed, the red lights flashed, and from the chamber's small audio speakers, which were supposed to be silent, a new sound bled through. It wasn't the alarm. It was a whisper. A faint, distorted, impossible echo riding the wave of energy surging into the minds of the two men. It was a voice she hadn't heard in 30 years. The voice of her brother, lost to a stasis leak in the ossuary when she was just a child. The echo did not fade. It shattered. One moment the image of Aris Thorne's dead wife was suspended in the air above the harmonization chair, her face a mask of placid grief. The next, it dissolved into a million motes of cold blue light, each one a tiny dying star. The voice, that impossible, intimately familiar voice, was severed mid-syllable, cut off by a sharp crackle of static that smelled of ozone and burnt faith. Silence descended upon the chamber. Not the great stillness the architects preached, a state of serene order, but a heavy, suffocating vacuum. The high-pitched whine of the chair's magnetic coil spooled down,
its descent in pitch a mournful sigh that echoed the collapsing structure of Vespera's world. The only remaining sounds were the rhythmic drip of condensation from a corroded pipe near the vaulted ceiling and the unsteady rasp of her own breathing. She stood frozen, her fingers still hovering over the control panel of the harmonization unit. The smooth, cool plasteel felt alien beneath her fingertips, no longer an instrument of control, but a conduit for violation. The data on the screen was a meaningless scrawl of post-event diagnostics. System integrity, nominal. Subject biofeedback, elevated but stable. Resonance bleed, purged. Purged. The word was a lie. That voice hadn't been purged. It had burrowed into her. It was still there, an echo inside her own skull, whispering in the forgotten dialect of her grandmother, a dialect from the hydroponic communes of Callisto, dead for 2 centuries. It had spoken of the frost ferns, of the way they tasted when fried with yeast paste, a memory so specific, so deeply buried beneath layers of architect training and neural harmonization that Vespera herself had forgotten it existed. An impersonal system glitch could not know that. A random corruption of data could not be so precise, so personal, so exquisitely cruel. What was that? Aris Thorne's voice was rough, a scientist grappling with an equation that had suddenly become sentient. He was still strapped into the harmonization chair, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and obsessive curiosity. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the empty space where the ghost of his wife had been. Beside him, the scavenger, Hroldar Brecker, pushed himself away from the wall. His face, a roadmap of cynicism and hard living, was tight with suspicion. He ignored Aris, his gaze pinning Vespera to the spot. That wasn't just a glitch, architect. Your machine, it spoke. It used her face, but it spoke something else. What kind of trick is this?
A trick? The thought was a lifeline, and she grabbed for it. Yes, a trick, a complex piece of psi warfare, an attack. But by whom and how? The harmonization network was a closed loop, the most secure system on Ethelgard. Its entire purpose was to prevent this exact kind of contamination. Vespera took a staggering step back, her boots scuffing on the polished floor. The motion broke the paralysis. The chamber, once a symbol of sterile order and control, now felt like a sepulchre. The air, thick with the metallic tang of recycled water and the faint sweet rot of formaldehyde piped in from the ossuary levels below, coated her tongue. Her belief system, a construct as rigid and ornate as the Gothic arches of the station itself, was crumbling. Resonance is the entropic decay of neural data. It is chaotic. It is impersonal. It is noise. The words of her mentor, Commander Cassian, were a catechism she had recited for years. It was the foundational principle of their order, the justification for every memory erased, every emotion flattened, every life brought into the cold embrace of the great stillness. Noise doesn't have a favorite recipe. Noise doesn't know the specific cadence of a long-dead woman's lullaby. This wasn't noise. This was a scalpel. I don't know, she finally managed, the words hollow in her own ears. Her voice, usually so measured and calm, trembled. She lowered her gaze to the datapad in her hand, but the glowing text might as well have been ancient runes. You don't know? Hroldar scoffed.
taking a step closer. The scent of rust and damp earth clung to him. "This is your temple, your goddamn machine. It just reached into my head. I saw the rust guard and rad scrubbers failing, saw faces I haven't seen in years. And it looked at him," he jutted his chin toward Aris, "and it spoke with a ghost from your past. So I'll ask again, explain it." His aggression was a grounding force. She looked up from the datapad, meeting his hard stare. For the first time, she didn't see a dreg, a subject, a piece of the station's messy biological refuse to be managed. She saw an ally, someone else who had been touched by the phantom, who had seen the lie. Her training compelled her to assert authority, to call for a security detail, to sedate them both and wipe the last 10 minutes from their minds. But the thought of using the harmonizer again sent a wave of nausea through her. She looked at the chair, gleaming chrome and padded restraints under the cold blue light. It was no longer a tool for healing. It was a violation engine. A doorway left open for something invasive and monstrously intelligent to walk right into the most private corners of their minds. The voice. "It changed," Aris murmured, his focus still inward. "At first, it was Lyra, but then something else. Another layer. Vespera." He finally turned his head, his gaze fixing on her with an unnerving intensity. "What did you hear?" Her mouth went dry. To admit it would be heresy. It would be an admission that the architect's entire dogma was built on a foundation of sand, that their control was an illusion. It would make her an outcast, echo-lost. But the lie was lodged in her throat, a physical obstruction. She couldn't say it was nothing. She couldn't dismiss it as a system error. The memory of the frost ferns was too vivid, the ghost of her grandmother's voice too real. They had taught her that emotion was chaos, that personal memory was a weakness. Yet the architect's greatest enemy had just used her own memory against her with surgical precision, turning a source of buried warmth into a weapon of psychological terror. She let the datapad slip from her trembling fingers. It clattered onto the deck, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. She looked from Aris's haunted, questioning face to Hrodal's wary, demanding one. They were her prisoners. They were meant to be her assignment, but the thing in the machine had made them witnesses, co-conspirators. The architects weren't protecting the station from chaos. They were curating it. Or they were liars, covering up a truth so terrible they had to build an entire philosophy to hide it. Either way, they were wrong. Her faith, once as solid and unyielding as the station's durasteel hull, had been crushed into dust. She slowly raised her head, the meticulously constructed mask of the calm, efficient architect falling away to reveal the shattered woman beneath. "They lied," she whispered. The two words an act of treason that felt like the first honest breath she had taken in years. Silence fell. Not the engineered, perfected tranquility of the great stillness, but a dead, ringing void where the impossible had just been. Vespera Lyrian stood frozen, her hand hovering over the holographic console of the neural harmonization unit. The air, usually thick with the scent of ozone and sterile cleansers, now carried a phantom charge, the ghost of a signal that had torn through the chamber's sanctified protocols. It was a scent like burnt sugar and sorrow.
On the polished chrome chairs before her, the two men were slack in their restraints. The scavenger, Hroldar, was blinking slowly, his rugged face pale beneath the grime. But her eyes were fixed on the xenobiologist, Aris Thorne. His head was bowed, hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. It was his wife's face, the data-mined image of the deceased Lyra Thorne that the resonance had used as its vessel. Her lips, her eyes, her ghost in the machine. But the voice, Annalise. The name was a shard of glass in Vespera's mind. It wasn't a name she used. It wasn't a name she was supposed to remember. Her great-aunt, dead for 60 years, interred somewhere in the lower ossuary levels. A memory harmonized out of existence when Vespera was just a girl, deemed an unnecessary emotional attachment by the mentors who had shaped her. But the resonance, wearing Aris's wife's face, had spoken with Annalise's voice. It had whispered a lullaby only she could have known. It hadn't just hijacked the system. It had reached inside Vespera's skull and stolen from her.
A single red light pulsed on the console, a patient, accusatory heartbeat. Event log 77B Delta, unexpected resonance cascade, awaiting technician report. Her training, 2 decades of ironclad conditioning, screamed at her. Report, isolate, purge. That was the litany. The architects demanded order. They demanded the containment of all such corruptions. A single command would upload the log to the central server. Superiors would be alerted. A suppression team would be dispatched. Aris Thorne and Hroldar Brecker would have their minds wiped clean, their memories of this moment scoured away until nothing remained but a compliant, placid blankness. And her? She would be quarantined, debriefed, and subjected to a deep, punishing harmonization herself for being compromised. They would scour Annalise from her mind all over again, more thoroughly this time. The violation would be erased. The truth would be buried under layers of manufactured stillness. Her gaze drifted from the pulsing red light to the men. Thorne was stirring, a low groan escaping his lips. He lifted his head, his eyes unfocused, swimming with a pain that was more than physical. He looked lost, echo-lost. The insult, once a term of derision she might have used herself, now tasted like ash in her mouth. That was the crux of it. The lie. The architects preached that memory was chaos, that emotion was a disease. They offered tranquility as salvation. But this felt different. The resonance hadn't been chaotic. It had been specific, targeted. It had used Thorne's grief as a key and her own buried past as the lock. It was an act of profound, intimate violation. And the idea of simply erasing it, of allowing her superiors to smooth it over as a mere system glitch, felt like a second, deeper betrayal. It was a betrayal of herself. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, discordant rhythm that defied every tenet of the great stillness. For her entire life, she had been a guardian of the perimeter, a keeper of the clean, sterile order. Now, the corruption was inside the walls. It was inside her. And in that moment, she realized she was more afraid of the cure her masters offered than the disease itself. To find the truth behind this violation, that was now the only thing that mattered. It was a singular, burning focus that eclipsed a lifetime of conditioning. The red light pulsed. Awaiting report.
Vespera's hand, which had been trembling, became still. Her decision was made. There was no going back. She was stepping off a cliff she had never even known was there. Her fingers, once agents of control, now became instruments of treason. They flew across the holographic interface, her movements swift and certain. She bypassed the report prompt, her architect-level clearance slicing through the lower-level security protocols. A new window opened, local data logs. Her own biometrics, the subject's neural feedback, the energy signature of the resonance wave, it was all there, a perfect digital record of the crime. She didn't hesitate. Her finger stabbed at the icon labeled Manual Purge. A new prompt, stark and final, filled the screen. Warning, this action is irreversible. All session data will be permanently erased. Proceed? The red light on the console pulsed, as if pleading with her. She pressed confirm. The system whirred, a soft final sigh. The data streams on the display collapsed into nothing. The red light blinked twice, then went dark. The event, according to Ithilgard's network, had never happened. She took a sharp, clean breath, the recycled air feeling thin, inadequate. She spun away from the console and strode to a maintenance panel on the wall, the heels of her boots clicking sharply on the polished floor. She keyed in an override code, and with a percussive sss, the electromagnetic restraints on both chairs disengaged. The cuffs around Aris and Rodar's wrists and ankles fell away with a clatter. Rodar was already moving before the metal hit the floor, rubbing his wrists, his eyes sharp and analytical. He looked from Vespera to the dead console, a flicker of grudging understanding in his gaze. Aris, however, was slower. He pushed himself up, leaning on the arm of the chair, his face a mask of confusion. What did you do?" he murmured, his voice hoarse. Vespera ignored him. Her eyes scanned the room and landed on the small, sterile tray next to the harmonization unit. On it lay the items confiscated from the two men: a rusted hydrospanner, a half-empty packet of nutrient paste, and a small, dark rectangle of silicon. Rodar's data chip, the very reason they had been brought here. She snatched it, its cool, smooth surface a point of absolute certainty in her dissolving world. She closed her fist around it, the sharp edges digging into her palm.
Finally, she turned to face them. Her uniform, once a symbol of unimpeachable authority, now felt like a costume. The composed, serene mask of the architect-technician was gone, stripped away. In its place was something raw, something desperate. "We have to go," she said, her voice tight, devoid of its usual clipped precision. It was the voice of a conspirator, the voice of a traitor. Now. The door to the harmonization chamber slid open with a soft chime, revealing the familiar dimly lit corridor beyond, a vista of faded gold frescoes and flickering emergency lights. But it was not the same corridor she had walked down an hour ago. Then it had been a path of duty. Now it was an escape route. The heavy mag-seal door slammed shut, the boom echoing once before being swallowed by the oppressive silence of the service corridor. For a full 3 seconds, there was only the sound of 3 sets of lungs gasping for air, the frantic rasp of adrenaline-fueled flight. Aris pressed his back against the cold, corrugated metal, his own breathing a ragged counterpoint to the station's eternal low hum. The air was thick here, tasting of rust and old water. A single emergency strip light on the ceiling flickered, failed, then sputtered to life again, casting their faces in a sickly, pulsing crimson. He saw them in the intermittent glow. Rodar Brecker, the scavenger, was already moving, his wiry frame coiled like a spring. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom of the rust gardens, scanned the darkness with an animal's alertness. And then there was Vespera, the architect-technician, the woman who not 10 minutes ago had been strapping him into a neural harmonization chair to selectively fry his memories. She stood stiffly,
her pristine gray uniform now smudged with grime, her face a pale, emotionless mask that didn't quite conceal the tremor in her hands. The sigil of the architects of silence, a perfect closed circle, gleamed on her collar like a brand. Lyra's face swam in his mind's eye, not her true face, but the one from the harmonization chair, the resonance echo. Her lips moving, but speaking with a voice that wasn't hers, a voice that had cracked Vespera's composure like a fault line through bedrock. Hope and horror warred in Aris's chest. It was a violation, but it was also a connection. Proof that Lyra's memory wasn't just a glitch in his own broken psyche. It was real. It was communicating. Don't move.
Hroldar was on Vespera in a flash. One grimy hand clamped over her mouth, the other slammed her back against the weeping wall. The dull glint of a ceramic blade appeared by her throat. Water dripped from a leaky pipe above, a slow, steady metronome marking the seconds of her life. "Give me one reason, architect," Hroldar hissed, his voice a low growl. "One single, solitary reason I don't open you up right here and leave you for the maintenance drones." Vespera didn't struggle. Her eyes, wide in the red light, locked onto Aris. They weren't pleading. They were burning. "Hroldar, stop!" Aris scrambled forward, grabbing the scavenger's shoulder. The man was all sinew and bone, but held a surprising strength. "She got us out! The alarm, the unlocked door, that was her!" "She was going to cook our brains 5 minutes ago," Hroldar spat, not taking his eyes or his knife off Vespera. "Oh, but she had a change of heart, a sudden bout of conscience. People like her don't have a conscience, Aris. They have objectives." He was right. Aris knew he was right. Trusting her was insane. But that echo, that moment when the system broke. "Let her speak," Aris said, his voice tight. Hroldar held the pose for another heartbeat, his face a mask of pure, distilled cynicism. Then, with a grunt of disgust, he yanked the blade back and shoved Vespera away from him. "Fine, talk, but if I smell a lie, I'll finish this." Vespera stumbled but caught her balance, rubbing her throat. She didn't look at Hroldar. Her gaze remained fixed on Aris, intense and unwavering. "He's right," she said, her voice a low, controlled tremor. "I don't have a conscience. I had a belief. That belief was a lie." She took a breath, the first sign of composure returning. The great stillness, the sanctity of a quiet mind, free from the chaos of memory, that's the foundation of our order. We suppress resonance because it is the ultimate chaos, a corruption, a disease. "Get to the point," Hroldar grumbled, wiping his blade on his trousers.
"The point," Vespera snapped, her voice cracking with fury, "is that during the harmonization, the resonance event didn't just manifest, it hijacked the system. It spoke. It used the neural trace of your dead wife, Dr. Thorne." She looked at Aris, and for the first time he saw something other than anger in her eyes. He saw a shared violation. "And it spoke to me with the voice of my great-grandmother, a name I only know from a forbidden family record. It quoted a text from the colony's founding, a text I was disciplined for even accessing." A heavy silence descended, broken only by the drip, drip, plink of water. Aris felt a cold thrill run down his spine. It wasn't random. It wasn't a glitch. It was targeted, intelligent. "It knew you," Aris breathed. "It knew both of us. It knew how to break my faith, she corrected, her voice turning to ice. The architects told us resonance was noise, random synapses firing in the deceased, like phantom limbs. They lied. They've been lying about all of it. They don't just want to suppress it. They're afraid of what it's saying. Roldar scoffed, leaning against the opposite wall. So, the bosses are liars. Welcome to Aethelgard. What does that have to do with us? Why save us? Because I am a loose end now, Vespera stated, the fact laid bare and raw. They will know the harmonization failed. They will see the system logs. They will see my authorization codes. By now, I am marked for erasure, a traitor, just like you. She gestured between Aris and Roldar. Fugitives, echo lost. We are all the same thing now, a threat to the great stillness. Aris felt the walls of the corridor press in. She was right. There was no going back, not for any of them. The life he had known, the quiet purgatory of his lab, was gone. So what do we do? Aris asked, the question hanging in the damp air. Vespera's eyes gleamed. We do the one thing they never expect. We find the truth, the real truth. More riddles, Roldar sighed. It's not a riddle, she said, stepping closer to them, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial hush. Every system has its source code. Every lie has an original truth it was built to hide. Aethelgard's history is rewritten constantly. Our memories are harmonized. But there is one place that cannot be rewritten, only sealed away. A place I was never supposed to know exists, something I only learned about from that forbidden text my great-grandmother wrote. The Foundational Data Archive, the station's uncorrupted birth certificate, locked away beneath the oldest part of the ossuary. Aris's scientific mind raced. An unredacted archive, data from the founding, from before the colony's failure, before the architects, before everything. It would hold the truth about Kepler 186F. It would hold the truth about resonance. It's impossible to get to, Roldar said flatly. The ossuary's core is a fortress. Even the architects don't go there without a battalion of security. They won't, Vespera countered, a flicker of a cold, grim smile touching her lips for the first time. Not if the battalion is chasing phantom power failures in the rust gardens. She looked pointedly at Roldar. Not if a senior technician is creating ghost-in-the-machine diversions across the upper spires. She held her own gaze. And not if a disgraced xenobiologist, one who knows more about alien neural mapping than anyone on this station, is the one to interface with whatever we find down there. Her gaze fell on Aris. I have the security protocols, the back doors my mentor taught me. I can draw the map. Roldar stared at her, his suspicion warring with a dawning understanding. You want to pull a heist. I want to pull the lie out by its roots, she corrected. I can't do it alone. I can bypass software, but not pressure plates and old-world mechanics. I don't know the station's forgotten pathways, the unmonitored ducts you live in. You do. She turned back to Aris. And neither of us knows what the resonance is, but you feel it. It's connected to you. You're the key to understanding what we'll be stealing. She stood before them, a heretic in the uniform of a priest, not an ally, not a friend, a weapon looking for a hand to wield it. We are a tool broken into 3 pieces, useless apart, but together. The hum of the station seemed to grow louder.
The dripping water echoed the frantic beat of Aris's heart. He looked from Vespera's burning, fanatical eyes to Heroldar's grim, calculating stare. An architect, a scavenger, a scientist, an unholy, desperate alliance. It was madness. It was suicide. It was the only path forward. "Okay," Aris said, the word feeling immense in the small, dark space. He saw a flicker of surprise in Heroldar's eyes, a flicker of grim satisfaction in Vespera's. "We're in. Where do we begin?"